Welcome to the Radically Genuine Podcast. I am Dr. Roger McFillin. Imagine a world where the way we think about our minds, our very sanity, is as culturally constructed as a Big Mac. A world where the rich tapestry of human experience, woven over millennia by diverse cultures, is flattened into a one-size-fits-all model of mental health. This is happening right now, and we're the ones doing it. For decades, America has been exporting more than just movies, music, and fast food. We've been shipping our ideas about the human psyche across the globe, packaged with the certainty of science and the promise of relief. But what if, in our rush to heal the world, we're actually changing the very nature of mental illness itself? Think about it. We categorize disorders, define what is normal and what's not, and then present these ideas to the world as undeniable truths. We send our therapists, our drugs, our DSM manuals to the far corners of the earth, confident that we're spreading enlightenment and relief. But here's the unsettling question. What if mental illness isn't a universal constant? What if the way we experience psychological distress is as culturally shaped as the food we eat or the clothes we wear? From China to Tanzania, from Sri Lanka to Japan, a disturbing trend has emerged. As our Western ideas about mental health spread, so do our mental illnesses. It's as if we're not just treating these conditions, we're planting them. We're living in an age where a teenager in Hong Kong can develop a quintessential American form of anorexia, where a grieving tsunami survivor in Sri Lanka can be labeled with PTSD before they've had a chance to process their own loss in their own cultural context, where pharmaceutical companies can literally create a market for depression medication in Japan by redefining what it means to be depressed. The implications are staggering. We're not just changing how the world talks about mental illness, we're changing mental illness itself. And in doing so, we may be robbing cultures of their unique ways of understanding and coping with psychological distress. This isn't just about them, it's about us. By examining our impact on other cultures, we're forced to confront our own assumptions. What if our understanding of mental health isn't as objective or universal as we think? What if in our quest to categorize and medicalize every aspect of human suffering, we're missing something crucial about the human experience? Today, we're going to deep dive into this unsettling reality. We'll explore how America became the world's therapist and what happens when we export our ideas about the mind. We'll challenge our assumptions, question our certainties, and perhaps, just perhaps, learn to see how our culture's approach to mental health may be perceived in a new light. Our guide on this eye-opening expedition is Ethan Waters, an investigative journalist and author. He's most widely known for his book, Crazy Like Us, The Globalization of the American Psyche, which was published in 2010. He's appeared on a number of media outlets such as Good Morning America, Talk of the Nation, and CNN. He's written articles published in the New York Times Magazine, Spin, Details, Mother Jones, Glamour, GQ, Esquire, and the San Francisco Chronicle Magazine. Ethan Waters, welcome to the Radically Genuine Podcast.
Roger, it's so nice to be here, and what a nice introduction. That was, I couldn't have written it better myself, so thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the show. I mean, I just recently was exposed to your work. I was telling you before we got on, I wish I would have read this in 2010 because it's that enlightening. And right now, I have a training clinic here in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where we train psychologists and licensed professional counselors. And just from a cultural perspective, we're going to make your book like mandatory reading. We're going to do some continued education on it. But it's been almost 15 years since you published Crazy Like Us. I'm curious, number one, what inspired you to write this book? And then what was the response at the time of publication?
So how I got to the idea is a little bit of a long story, but maybe I'll answer the second part first, which is um, it was a remarkably positive reaction. It was interesting within the profession, so you make the case that people are tromping into other cultures with little understanding of the local modes of expressing mental illness, local modes of healing. And I got a lot of people saying, yes, when I go to another culture, I'm super respectful of those cultures, but the guy down the hall, he's got a real problem. So there was a lot of finger pointing at the other guy, or the other, organization, that they don't do it right. But our organization, when we, do our interventions in other cultures, we're really respectful. So there was not a lot of pushback. Some of the people in the book didn't, their portrayals weren't the most flattering. Those people were unhappy, as they often are. How I got to the idea is, a little bit longer story. I started, in the early 90s, early 1990s, writing about recovered memory phenomenon and the sort of the controversy surrounding people going into therapy and coming out with memories of, being abused as infants, and then the ways in which those notions often spread to ideas of multiple personality disorder, ideas of satanic cult abuse. There was a way in which those ideas really spread through the mental health profession. And if you wanted a lesson in how culture can shape a person or shape even things as fundamental to us as memory, that was my introduction to that. So it was very clear that, to me, from having written Making Monsters, which is my first book, collaboration with Richard Offshay, that culture has a unique impact on our sense of self all the way through. And then, if you think about something like multiple personality disorders, which is now called dissociative identity disorder, and you realize it doesn't exist in all times and all places in the same form, that it can rise in one moment in culture and sort of go away in the next, in the next generation. And you begin to look across history, you could see this pattern repeat again and again. There's times when anorexia arises. There's things like hysteria that happen. It comes in these generational waves. You begin to realize that something else is happening besides, mental illnesses being the same everywhere and the same at all times. So you can look at it two ways. You can look at it across history and see those waves, or you could look at it across cultures. And when I began to look at it across cultures, I ran into these remarkable cross-cultural psychiatrists who were studying the ways in which other cultures express mental illnesses differently, but also the way in which it's changing, and the way in which we're impacting how other cultures think about mental illnesses, and how that actually relates to how they get expressed, which symptoms become salient in that moment in history. So I began to follow these cross-cultural psychiatrists to their various expertise around the world. One took me to Zanzibar, and one to Sri Lanka, to Japan, and began to document their work, which was just remarkable because, as I say in the book, I kind of compare these cross-cultural, scholars to botanists in the rainforest who are just trying to document the diversity of human thought, just one step ahead of the bulldozer. And the bulldozer is our American certainties about these things and how they're becoming sort of, how they're homogenizing notions of mental illness around the world.
Let's start with the concept of depression. I did mention previously before we jumped on here, asking you the question is, do you think possibly, maybe the American public is more open to some of these ideas? And the reason why I asked you that was because it seems like there's somewhat of an awakening to how we can be mass conditioned, especially by the medical authority, into adopting some ideas and being able to kind of step outside of our culture a little bit. And like when the veil's kind of pulled back and we can observe maybe like who's behind the kind of like the Wizard of Oz, who's behind some of these strong messagings, and who does it serve. That awakening kind of allows us to question some things that we previously may have accepted as like absolute truth, or there's pure strong scientific validity behind it. And so the concept of depression is an interesting one, because I think if you ask most Americans, at least 95% are going to say, yeah, like depression is a real, genuine medical illness. It's a condition. It certainly, can impair people, and has been observed cross-culturally, and it's acceptable going back centuries. So this is a disorder, and we're making advancements in the way that we understand and treat depression. Um, However, I don't think people realize to the degree it has been culturally constructed, and it is not a universally accepted kind of illness, disease, or disorder in the way we view it, whatever you want to call it. So I think this opens up the conversation about how other cultures may think about something like depression and have experienced it previously, and what has been our role then in shaping their culture's way of thinking about it.
No, it's a lot of interesting points there. Just, I think Americans and sort of people with a Western mind have a real problem with the notion of psychosomatic symptomology. The idea that some symptoms are given to you by culture because they're literally like the language of suffering for a moment in history, and your subconscious picks that up and understands that when I describe this depression, and depression is, in sort of a big general category, exists across time, across cultures. For someone, someone in another culture might complain of semen loss, or a feeling of a weak heartbeat, or, stomach pains. They might literally have a somatic expression of depression. We tend not to in the West. We tend to think of it as, up here in the mind and as cycling thoughts. It's very clear that it gets expressed differently. But here's the thing. That doesn't mean it's not, like, if it's culturally influenced, doesn't mean it's not real. Like, that's the problem we have in the West of, like, trying to understand that it can be absolutely real. A soldier's experience of PTSD, if it's expressed in a Western style, it just because those symptoms are fed to them by culture, you're unconscious by culture, doesn't mean they're not also absolutely real. So understanding this phenomenon, understanding that culture shapes our symptomology, is not a easy way to a fix. It's not the way to sort of, you can't just suddenly say, oh, if culture has fed me these ways of expressing this mental illness, then I can suddenly overcome it just by sheer will. But I think you're also right that there are ways of stepping, we can step back from the stories that we get told about depression. The story in the West is often like, this is a serotonin imbalance, which may have some medical truth to it, but it's also a story. It's a story you tell yourself about your brain being out of whack. Like, so you separate even that you can separate the medical truth of something from the story that truth entails. And in the book, I talk about schizophrenia in Africa and the way in which that culture is now juggling a notion between spirit possession as the cause for schizophrenia and the sort of Western idea of it's a medical imbalance, something is wrong with the brain. So you have these two stories, right? And I'm not a person that believes in spirit possession. I'm from the West. I tend to sort of believe that the Western notion of the mind. But the next question you have to ask yourself is, what is the downstream consequences of that story? And so in Zanzibar, where I went with an anthropologist, the downstream consequences of the spirit possession story is often one, it's a little bit counterintuitive, but it's the one that keeps the person within the group, because everyone in that culture tends to believe that they're possessed by spirits when they get angry sometimes, or they do things that they didn't expect. So the idea that this person who is, has a schizophrenia is like us, only more so, allows them to keep that person within the group. And I think that's the key thing. And the notion of the medical notion of schizophrenia in the West tends to be the narrative that really pushes the person outside the group, that they're nothing like us, they're schizophrenic, they really frighten us, so they get pushed outside the group. So it's the truth or falseness of the story on a medical level is not the end of it. You have to sort of look at, like, what does the story mean next? What does it mean for group inclusion or exclusion? What does it mean for, other, how you view this person, sort of down the line?